Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. If you go back 4 or 5 decades to the era of Walter Cronkite on CBS and Huntley and Brinkley on NBC, the choices Americans had when it came to national news were distinctly limited. You had the TV networks, newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post, news magazines like Time and Newsweek, and not much else. Since then, there has been an explosion of what we now call media. We've seen a communications revolution, and it was supposed to make us much, much better informed. We'll see how that's been working out with my guest, Reed Richardson, a first-rate media critic for The Nation magazine. Reed, welcome. Thanks for
Glad to be here, Bob.
Coming in. I appreciate it. So you're a media critic, but today the term media can be applied to everything from soap operas to Twitter to the New York Times. When you talk about it, what do you mean by the term media?
Well, media is, as you said, a lot of different sort of streams coming at us. I try to look at the things that kind of set themselves up and hold themselves out as news gathering and information sharing activities or organizations. And those organizations sort of self-select as hewing to a set of ethics about honesty and transparency and authority and sourcing and some kind of fundamentals about the nuts and bolts of how we convey information, record conversations, things like that.
Right. In terms of the major press outlets, if you take the New York Times and the Washington Post, the major TV networks, cable news, and increasingly the web, how's the media doing? I mean, you don't have to give it a grade, but in general, is it a good job or mediocre or not so great?
I think you could give it sort of often an incomplete. It's probably the best grade to give it. I mean, the good news is the preponderance of all these new media outlets gives sort of 1,000, the old let 1,000 flowers bloom prophecy. And that means there's much more chance for good reporting and good journalism to happen. And it is happening out there. There's a lot of it that is good. The problem is it's often washed over in a tide of sort of, inane or minutia kind of journalism that doesn't really help further the conversation or engage the public in our democracy. And so the good can often get lost in sort of a tide of bad.
One of the things that's been a hallmark for several years now, I guess, is more and more opinion where you used to get news and facts. And that's especially true on television, and especially cable television, where you have talking heads sometimes around the clock. Is this primarily because talking heads are cheaper than news gathering? A lot of bureaus have closed and that sort of thing. Or are there other factors at work?
I think at the end of the day, a bottom line cost driver is a big part of it. As you said, talking heads, it's cheaper to pay 4 salaries than to put a couple of correspondents on a plane and send them overseas and pay all that behind the scenes cost to get good on the ground reporting in Afghanistan. And people respond to opinion, right? It gets the kind of engines of outrage going and fired up. I think there's nothing wrong with analysis. I'm a big proponent of sort of letting reporters and journalists make assumptions and then follow them up with evidence and say, hey, look, here's the real facts on the ground. And that might feel like it's shading from just facts into opinion, but that's what the reporter is there for, as I see it. He's an expert on the ground, or she's an expert on the ground. They need to bring that expertise, the beat that they cover every day, to the reporting. They shouldn't just be sort of stenographers that are just repeating what one side says and then the other side says and leaves it up to the public or the viewer to kind of make a guess at what's really going on.
But increasingly, that reporting is getting left behind. So you mentioned beats, for example. It used to be that you'd have a political beat and an education beat and a health beat and a labor beat, et cetera, et cetera. Increasingly, those beats have vanished. And what you're left with is just analysis or just opinion. And especially, I think, on the web, where almost everybody's a critic. Do you find this to be problematic?
It can be difficult, absolutely. And you're right, everybody can be a critic. That's somewhat democratizing because views that would be marginalized in the past, whether they be minorities or women or people of color and in other situations that would never be heard in the mainstream media, now have a voice that can be equal, especially, and that's why social media has such a powerful impact and has been adopted, particularly in the black community. But at the same time, you're right, a lot of what passes for analysis today is just sort of punditry, and there's a difference there. And analysis, I like to think, is grounded in somebody who knows the issues, knows the policies behind the issues, and can speak informatively about them, rather than somebody who just sort of is focused on the optics or the theatrics of the issue and sort of riling up a response and getting viewers and audience.
And that's one of the things that has concerned me. If it's informed analysis, that's great. Increasingly what we're seeing is it's just everybody just has an opinion. So you're getting through media the same kind of thing that years ago, or probably even today, you would hear around the kitchen table or from your buddies in the bar on the weekend or something like that. In other words, it's just chatter, but it's not informed chatter. And one of the things that I really worry about is if you take someone who's not a sophisticated reader or TV watcher, for example, let's say a junior in high school or a sophomore in college, there's so much media. How do they navigate it? How do they know what's legitimate and what's not? How can they tell the difference between informed opinion and nonsense?
Right. And what's interesting is a lot of them, if you look at some studies that have done, people in the late stages of the millennials and sort of the teenagers, which is the next generation coming up, they really get a lot of their quote-unquote news through services you wouldn't think of as news organizations, like Facebook, like Reddit, Snapchat. I mean, these are organizations that were set up as sort of personal communication platforms, but have become, through social sharing, a way to validate someone else is sort of acting as a filter for you, for your news, right? I'm sharing something with you, I'm putting my stamp, my imprimatur on it, and that's how a lot of younger people get their news now. It's sort of a second-hand way. It's already kind of been approved or sanctioned through another person. They're not going to go directly to the New York Times website because it's maybe a little bit intimidating, or maybe it might be just too much for them to process. They're letting someone else kind of do that for them. Here's an interesting story that frankly might already sort of confirm their institutional or biases that they have, whether they be political or sort of social or cultural.
Have you looked pretty closely at this?
I've done some research, but for some of my columns, but I haven't really, frankly, looked at the younger generation as much. But just being out there and sort of marinating in social media every day, you kind of begin to see that people are really pulling different threads to get their information, and it can be good. And I think some of it is a response to, even though a lot of what we might say is opinion is uninformed, I think that the establishment or the sophisticated opinion that you might see or might expect to see on the Sunday morning news shows, for example, really isn't that much more informed a lot of times than what you might see around or hear around the kitchen table.
I agree that that's true. And that sort of, to me, that compounds the problem. I mean, one side compounds the other side. But I would look really with trepidation at the idea of getting your news filtered by friends where who knows what the sources might be. It's hard for me to believe that a person who gets their news primarily that way is a well-informed citizen who can cast a vote with any sense of reasonable understanding of the issues, or who could serve competently on a jury, which is one of the things a citizen's supposed to be able to do. This would worry me. It doesn't seem to be worrying you very much, though.
I think these are probably a lot of the same problems that people were saying, or the same arguments they might have been having when the advent of radio, right, and the advent of television, right? I mean, I think television initially was sort of looked at with a lot of sort of, dismissal by radio and newspapers, because those were the established news platforms of the time. I mean, I think it's an ongoing and it's a always churning generational problem. I agree that, what I think you do see is that your news diet becomes very rather than robust and varied, as you might want to expect or get from eating, right? Your nutritional diet. Your news diet gets very one-sided, right? Or it gets very locked into sort of a certain kind of content, and eventually that is, it becomes very superficial and doesn't sustain your civic needs, right? You might just be kind of getting a steady stream of one kind of news, whether it might be about politics and one viewpoint in politics or one part of culture.
One of the things you've written about is the press's tendency toward fear-mongering. Everything is a crisis. The news is delivered in many cases with a sense of alarm. Talk about that a little bit.
In the writing that I did in the run-up to the midterm elections, I really began to see that much more prevalently. I do feel it's somewhat of a remnant of the post-9/11 era, right? Since that time, there really seems to have been a sea change in how the press thinks of itself and its duty to its readers, as well as sort of here in the U.S., it's almost sort of civic or patriotic duty. And sort of warning of potential threats has become this sort of overarching mission. And in the end of the summer and into the fall, when the threat of ISIS arose, a lot of punditry and Washington establishment media, pushed so hard that this idea was something we can't not address, right? And that doing something, whatever it may be, would be better than not doing something. There was no belief in having stepping back, taking a moment, and looking at perhaps diplomatic solutions to the problem. There's this sort of knee-jerk reaction in a lot of the elite media that military force is sort of the first and only option, and that we have to resort to that because we're always under threat, right? And
it's not just the issue of terror. I mean, we've gone through the Ebola coverage.
Right.
Whenever there's some kind of a problem with an airliner, whether it's gone missing or if there is a crash. Now, these are all serious issues. No one's making light of them, but sometimes the almost hysterical coverage can make people think that they're more likely to be threatened by these things than they really are.
Right. In a way, it is sort of journalistic malpractice when you spend hours and hours hyping the threat of Ebola, which is a disease that has had 1 or 2 cases in the United States, and that is transmittable through direct contact for someone who's in the middle of the disease, versus the flu.
Yeah,
right?
really only
tens of thousands of people die every
year
year from the flu, but the coverage is never going to be proportional because Ebola is this exotic, foreign thing that is easy to sort of feed your stereotypes about fear, right? And flu is so banal, but even though it's more dangerous, there's no way that it would draw viewers.
So the threat of the flu is a much more potential threat to individuals in the United States than Ebola, and the flu can in fact be deadly, whereas Ebola, there's only been a handful of cases and certainly no epidemic.
It goes to the same thing with the airliner, right? When the Malaysian airliner crashed, it got hours and hours of news coverage, and if you were to be sort of put off by air travel from that and drove, you'd be much more likely to die, because tens of thousands of people die in the U.S. every day or every year from auto accidents. Plane travel has never been safer.
So if you got in a car because you were afraid of air travel, you're heightening the danger that something will happen to you.
You're increasing your risk, and the press is feeding into this sort of misunderstanding of what really threatens us on a daily basis.
So you mentioned ISIS, and we've been at war to some degree or another ever since the September 11th attacks. But most of the time, there's hardly any coverage of these wars. They're either on the back pages or they're not covered at all, including we don't get much coverage of the men and women who are killed in these wars, and certainly not foreigners who are killed in these wars. Can you talk a little bit about our wartime coverage, and especially and you've mentioned this, the absence of anti-war views or views that are critical of American policy.
Right. I mean, the press from 9/11 on has sort of had this propensity to continue to, hype war, cover war at its onset, right, or in its lead up. And we saw the sort of disastrous results of that sort of feeding into an administration's viewpoint, in the run-up to the Iraq invasion. But as you said, the follow-up and the follow-through just isn't there. And again, part of that is foreign news bureaus are shut down.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of interest from a news corporation perspective of making a dedicated effort to covering Afghanistan for 10 years and putting correspondents in country. Whereas it's easy to kind of talk about the next threat and the war we need to have next. And we saw that with ISIS in the last couple of weeks of August into September, when I studied sort of the Sunday news shows, which sort of stand in as sort of the purest distillation of sort of Washington establishment thinking. And what you saw was there was an almost perfect balance in terms of partisan guests, right? There was about a 50-50 breakdown between Democrats and Republicans, which on one level you might think, well, there's the press doing its job, sort of giving everybody their chance to air the views of the different parties. But if you really look at what they're talking about, what their views were toward ISIS, the difference was almost 100-to-1 in terms of pro-war versus anti-war. And that's a conscious decision being made on by these news organizations and these news shows to sort of validate one type of thought about war and to sort of dismiss or marginalize another.
And that, of course, shapes public opinion.
Sure.
Because collectively, media is so powerful.
Right, and when you tune into it and you hear a steady drumbeat of the same guests from both parties, you feel like, well, everybody agrees, even though, in fact, a poll of, the American public found a third of them didn't want to go to war in ISIS, and there was a sort of a proxy vote for the war in ISIS around that time about arming Syrian rebels.
Right.
And a third of Congress, collectively, when you kind of total up the Senate and the House, said we don't want to go to a war with ISIS. So that a third of the public and a third of Congress really got no play, sort of no voice on those Sunday morning news shows.
Now, one of the things we do get in abundance, from my perspective, in overabundance, is political coverage, and especially horse race coverage of campaigns that seem to be perpetual nowadays. And you wrote that the corporate media were among the biggest winners of this last election cycle. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you look at local TV in particular, because that's really where the dollars are going. 95% of the TV ad dollars this year went to local TV stations, because they're like the last bastion of sort of bipartisan news consumption. Both Republicans and Democrats say they get about half of their news from local TV, whereas a lot of their other news consumption is very broken down along partisan networks. And so if you want to attract the widest audience, that's where you put your money. And these, dark money groups, political PACs, they poured billions of dollars into these local TV stations in this last election. And not surprisingly, owners of local TV companies, which tend to be now bigger corporations, caught on to this after the Citizens United decision in 2010 and have been on a buying spree. And within last year, in fact, in 2013, the top 5 biggest owners of local TV stations spent nearly $9 billion buying up local TV stations in anticipation of what was going to be this political ad windfall, and it paid off. I mean, they saw huge amounts of money, revenues that will probably tide them over for the rest of the year, because that's where all these political organizations are putting their money to try and reach viewers. And
I assume this will only increase over the next year or a year and a half as we're coming into a presidential election cycle, which then drives the coverage of
you
local
always
elections.
see a spike. Presidential cycles tend to be running on a trend upward, as are midterm cycles. There is a gap because presidential cycles just draw that much more money, but they're both sort of trending up at different levels, but absolutely.
So how do we get into this idea of almost perpetual campaigning? Who's responsible? Is it the barons in corporate media, or has it been the candidates themselves, or is it the behind-the-scenes financiers? Who's driving this?
Well, there's a huge infrastructure of political coverage now, right? All these more websites, that means a bigger news hole to fill, and cable, there's more cable stations now. And part of it too is politicians feeding that. They're starting their campaigns earlier. And a lot of it too is the governance, or the lack thereof, in Washington means a lot of what you see on a daily basis isn't legislation or legislating, it's sort of political grandstanding, right, on the part of the parties. And that sort of feeds this idea that we're always campaigning, so we're always going to cover it like a campaign. And that's why, the day after the 2014 midterms, you saw a huge blossoming of, it's now time to turn to 2016 and let's talk about Hillary.
Right.
I mean, frankly, they've been talking about her a year before that already, but it doesn't seem to stop.
But what's also driving that? So we have all this punditry, and you have the talking heads on TV, but there's a general assumption that Hillary Clinton is the Democratic nominee going forward. I hear very few voices deviating from that company line. How did that come to be the case? I mean, if there's so much money out there and we have perpetual campaigns and that sort of thing, how is it that this one candidate is collectively crowned by just about everyone on TV?
Yeah, I think that's a mistake. I mean, I think it's preliminary to say that. Obviously, I think if you looked at the polling in 2006,
I agree with you. I think that's a mistake too. Yeah,
you would have seen that Hillary was leading the field, lapping the field,
right.
And Barack Obama was probably, barely even in the conversation. So it is probably premature to make that kind of assumption. The problem is when the established media sort of begins to lock in these narratives early on, right? And it really makes it more difficult for a candidate to break out. The Republicans in some sense have a benefit, or the Republican potential candidates do, because there's no sort of overarching conventional wisdom leader at this point. And so there's a lot more chance for them to, establish themselves and let the media sort of find them on the way they're campaigning. I think it is a problem, though, if the media sort of continues to reinforce this idea that Hillary is sort of on the march to a coronation.
You mentioned the Sunday morning talk shows, and thinking in terms of the network talk shows, we had, an upheaval at Meet the Press recently. But if you look at the ratings of the Sunday morning talk shows and then the nightly network news programs on CBS, NBC, and ABC, are they in the final stretch? Are those shows becoming anachronistic, or is there still a great deal of life and influence in them? How are they doing?
I think the future for the evening news broadcast is probably a bit more dire, because it held itself up for so long as speaking to a general audience, and really we just don't consume news that way. You talked about sort of a couple generations ago how limited our news choices were. This is sort of a remaining anachronism almost of that. People just don't sit down at 6:30 anymore at night and watch the evening news. I think the Sunday morning news shows have kind of developed themselves as a niche for a certain type of political junkie or a Washington establishment person, and they probably have a firmer base, and they're probably closer to where that core base will be. And I think they have a problem because they really don't speak to the rest of the country, right? And that might be fine, but they tend to have such a strong influence on what happens to the rest of the country that the dichotomy there between not really understanding the rest of the country and looking at what their needs are versus how much they can shape that is a problem.
I have other questions, but we're running out of time, so I'm hoping I can persuade you to come back, and especially as we move on in the political campaign, as it's coming up, to talk about developments there.
Absolutely.
Reed, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Bob. Thanks.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. The wealth gap in America just gets more and more extreme. The most recent data is from Emmanuel Saez at Berkeley and Gabriel Zuckman of the London School of Economics. It shows that 0.1% of the American population has nearly as much wealth as the bottom 90% of Americans combined. Nearly half of Americans have no wealth at all. No money in the bank, no equity in a home, no stocks, no bonds. Many have negative wealth in the sense that they're mired in debt. So the middle class is shrinking. The doorways of opportunity for our young people are growing narrower and narrower, while that tiny percentage of the population in the extreme upper strata, that 0.1%, is well on its way to acquiring virtually all of the nation's wealth. That's America's new aristocracy, and the millions who are struggling without much hope of getting ahead are today's version of the peasantry of old. I don't think that's what my civics teachers had in mind when they taught us many years ago about the glory of the American dream. That's all for now. See you next time.